As you begin working with ASP.NET Core MVC applications, you'll soon see that MVC looks an awful lot like classic ASP. There's a lot of features in common, so that really helps with the learning curve. But there's a lot that's different as well. And one of the big features that's new in MVC and ASP.NET Core are tag helpers. So basically, tag helpers are the successor to HTML helpers. HTML helpers in classic ASP.NET are basically just chunks of C# in a sea of HTML. It kind of harkens back, as I mentioned, to the days of classic ASP, when you had islands of VB script that floated in a sea of HTML. But HTML helpers back in classic ASP.NET were a big improvement over ASP. But one of the issues is that you have this context switch between the C# code and the HTML of the page as ASP.NET processes the page on the server in order to generate the HTML that's then rendered to the client. So tag helpers are implemented as elements and attributes. So it's basically just HTML with some custom attributes added, sort of. You can also have custom elements as well, as you'll see. Now, both HTML and tag helpers provide a way for server-side code to participate in creating and rendering HTML elements from Razor pages. And you can use either of them in ASP.NET Core views. And that's an important point. HTML helpers are still a part of ASP.NET Core, and you can continue using them. But I suspect once you get used to tag helpers, you'll probably start using them a lot more often. So tag helpers, again, are the successor and a huge improvement over HTML helpers that were in previous versions of the MVC Razor view pages. The nice thing about them is that they're way easier for designers and avoid the context switch issues between C# and HTML that you had with HTML helpers. But conceptually, they're more or less the same thing. And one nice thing is that, unlike some of the parameters of HTML helpers, you have rich IntelliSense to help you as you're designing a view using tag helpers. Now, there are many tag helpers included with ASP.NET Core. And these support doing various common tasks, doing things like creating forms, creating links, loading web page assets, and more. And even more are available in public GitHub repositories and as NuGet packages. So there's already a very rich ecosystem of tag helpers since they're so easy to develop and to use in a Razor view. And so that's one of the kind of amazing things that people have really embraced ASP.NET Core and are creating their own tag helpers and making them available, mostly for free. But a lot of the commercial component developers are jumping in the fray as well. Now, tag helpers are authored in C#, and when you look at the code, you'll see that they target HTML elements based on the element name, the attribute name, or the parent tag. For example, the built-in label tag helper can target the HTML label element when the label tag helper attributes are applied. And if you're familiar with HTML helpers, tag helpers reduce the explicit transitions between HTML and C# in Razor views. And that's an important point that I keep hitting on. The pages are just much more natural HTML. Okay, so let's talk about tag helpers in comparison with web form server controls. So according to Microsoft, there's a number of differences between tag helpers and the server controls in web forms. And just keep in mind that web forms is not a part of ASP.NET Core. So if you're looking to migrate a web forms application to ASP.NET Core, you're going to have to convert it completely from the ground up to an MVC application. Okay, so tag helpers, they don't own the element that they're associated with. They simply participate in the rendering of the element and the content. In comparison, web server controls are declared and invoked on a page. It's also kind of interesting that multiple tag helpers can act on the same element, which can lead to conflicts if you're not careful. So you have to design this with conflicts in mind. And that's in contrast to web server controls, because you typically can't compose web server controls and use them in combinations. And then tag helpers can modify the tag and content of HTML elements they're attached to, but don't directly modify anything else on the page. Web server controls have a less specific scope and can perform actions that affect other parts of the page, which could have some unintended side effects. And then web server controls, they have a non-trivial life cycle. Oh boy, if you've grappled with the events attached to web server controls in web forms application, it can be a nightmare. There's so many events that happen in different sequences depending on how you configure the controls and which server controls you're using and so forth. It was a nightmare just to figure out how to accomplish the most simple task with web server controls. I have to admit that I'm not looking back. I'm not missing web forms anymore. MVC, and particularly MVC and ASP.NET Core, is so much cleaner and easier to use. And then web server controls let you add functionality to the client DOM, the document object model. And tag helpers have no DOM associated with it. You're not able to manipulate the DOM like web server controls could. Web server controls also include automatic browser detection. So you can customize things based on which browser the page is going to be rendered to. And tag helpers, on the other hand, have no knowledge of the browser, and so you really can't customize them to the browser as such. And then web server controls use type converters to convert strings into objects. But tag helpers, on the other hand, you're working natively in C#, in this code that's within the class that executes when the page is being rendered or being produced on the server. So you don't need to do type conversion because everything's in C#. And then web server controls use system.component model to implement the runtime and design time behavior of components and controls. And this namespace includes the base classes and interfaces for implementing attributes and type converters, binding to data sources, and licensing components. So in contrast, tag helpers typically derive from the tag helper base class. And that class exposes only two methods, process and process async, as you'll see a little bit later. So in general, tag helpers are far more lightweight than server controls. And as you'll see, they're also unobtrusive, largely blending into the HTML code of the view, although Visual Studio has some very nice syntax highlighting to make it very clear where you're dealing with an element that is associated with a tag helper. Okay, so let's talk about the structure of a tag helper. And as you'll see, they look suspiciously like HTML, because of course it is HTML. So this is an element that I took right out of the standard register.cs HTML. As part of the project template for ASP.NET Core applications, if you select to create individual user accounts for authentication, then you get the register view, and this is an element that I took out of it. Okay, so a tag helper targets a specific HTML element. And this is called, oddly enough, the target element, which here is the input element. This is one place where tag helpers may be a little bit confusing. When you create the code for an input tag helper, it doesn't automatically target every input element in every view where the input tag helper is in use. It's only going to target those input elements that also have the ASP4 attribute, as well as various other tag helper attributes. So you use the various tag helper attributes to provide parameters to the tag helper. So to make this element a tag helper, you need two things. You need an element that a tag helper targets, so you need some definition within the project or in a NuGet package or reference that you include within the project that targets the input element. And ASP.NET Core has built-in tag helper that targets input, so we're good there. And then you need a tag helper attribute. You need both of those. And when you have both of them, Razor will magically turn this innocuous-looking HTML element into a tag helper imbued with superpowers. Okay, now, although the value here of the ASP4 attribute appears to be a string, email, it's in double quotes, looks an awful lot like a string. That's just really syntactic sugar that uses HTML's scheme of delimiting attribute values with double quotes. But instead, because this is a tag helper, email here is a property of the model bound to this view. And as you'll see later, the fact that this is not just a random string means that IntelliSense in Visual Studio can give you a list of possible ASP4 values because it knows what model is bound to the page because you've defined that in the header to the view, and it will look at those and give you a list of the properties that you can use when you're typing out ASP4, as well as other tag helper attributes. And very specifically, the value here is an attribute of the model expression type. That's a type within views that handles the mapping to the views model. It's really a pretty slick system. Okay, and then an element targeted by a tag helper can also contain any other valid HTML attributes. Here, for example, the class attribute, which are then passed right through to the HTML rendered by the browser. And a tag helper, and I'm going to use that term generically now from now on to mean, quote, an element targeted by a tag helper. So let's just call this element a tag helper. It can contain child elements, both tag helpers and plain old HTML. And then, depending on what the tag helper does, the child contents might be modified or passed through to the output HTML. Maybe wrapped in HTML, generated by the tag helper. It just depends on what you do within the tag helper itself. Now, this may sound a bit confusing and complicated, but most of the time you'll be dealing with a single HTML element, so it's really not all that convoluted in practice.